Everything started so perfectly. My food truck business, Authentic Eats, had been thriving for 3 years. I'd built it from scratch after selling my tech consulting firm, and honestly, it was more about passion than profit at this point. The truck was my baby, a gleaming silver Airstream converted with top-of-the-line equipment. I specialized in gourmet fusion tacos that had food bloggers driving from 3 counties over. I'd been parking legally on Maple Street, right outside Willowbrook Estates, for 18 months without a single complaint. The residents loved having quality food within walking distance, and I made sure to keep everything spotless. My permits were current, my insurance was comprehensive, and I followed every health code regulation to the letter. 20 years in corporate compliance taught me the value of dotting every I and crossing every T. That all changed the day Karen Mitchell moved into the neighborhood and somehow got herself elected HOA president within 6 months. Karen was the type of person who measured her grass with a ruler and filed noise complaints about children playing at 3 p.m. on a Saturday. She had perfectly coiffed blonde hair that never moved, even in wind storms, and the kind of smile that made you check your wallet afterward. Within her first week as HOA president, she'd already issued 17 violation notices for things like mailbox heights being off by 2 inches and garden gnomes being aesthetically inconsistent with neighborhood standards. The first time I met Karen, she marched up to my truck wearing a beige pantsuit and carrying a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "but I'm Karen Mitchell, HOA president of Willowbrook Estates. We need to discuss your little food situation here." I wiped my hands on my apron and stepped out of the truck. "Good afternoon. I'm Mike. Is there a problem? I make sure to keep the area clean, and all my permits are up to date." Karen's smile never wavered, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "The problem is that you're operating a commercial vehicle in a residential area. Our HOA bylaws clearly state that commercial activities within 500 feet of our property lines require board approval." "Here we go," I thought, but kept my expression neutral. "I'm actually parked on public property, not within your HOA boundaries. The city permits cover this location specifically." "Well," Karen huffed, her clipboard clutched tighter, "we'll just see about that. I'll be reviewing all the relevant ordinances and regulations. Don't think you can just set up shop wherever you please without consequences." As she walked away, her heels clicking aggressively on the pavement, I had no idea I'd just met my match in petty bureaucratic warfare. If I'd known then what I know now, I might have handled things differently. Then again, maybe not. The next morning, I arrived at my usual spot to find a parking meter that definitely hadn't been there the day before. Not just any parking meter, but one of those new digital ones that charged $5 per hour with a 4-hour maximum. There was also a fresh coat of yellow paint marking a no standing zone that encompassed exactly the footprint where I usually set up my serving window. Impressive, I had to admit. Karen had somehow convinced the city to install infrastructure overnight. That kind of pull required either serious connections or serious donations to the right political campaigns. Probably both. I called the city planning office and was transferred between 6 different departments before finally reaching someone who could explain the changes. Apparently, there had been multiple complaints about traffic congestion and pedestrian safety concerns filed simultaneously by several Willowbrook Estates residents. The complaints were detailed, professional, and referenced specific municipal codes I'd never heard of. The installation was expedited due to the severity of the safety concerns, the city clerk explained. The HOA president provided very thorough documentation of the hazards. I moved my truck 2 blocks down to another legal spot on Pine Avenue. The tacos were just as good, but foot traffic dropped by 70% overnight. Most of my regular customers were elderly residents who'd gotten used to the short walk to Maple Street. 2 blocks might as well have been 2 miles for some of them. Karen wasn't finished. Within a week, I started getting visits from every regulatory agency imaginable. The health department wanted to re-inspect my equipment, even though I'd passed my quarterly inspection just 3 weeks earlier. The fire marshal needed to verify my propane connections met current safety standards. Environmental Services wanted to discuss my waste disposal procedures. The business license department required updated documentation for my mobile vendor permit. Each visit was perfectly legitimate, professionally conducted, and completely unnecessary. But they were also time-consuming, expensive, and disruptive. While inspectors crawled through every inch of my truck, I couldn't serve customers. Each inspection cost me a full day of revenue. Someone's been busy making phone calls, I realized after the fourth unscheduled inspection in 2 weeks. The inspectors were apologetic but thorough. They'd received anonymous complaints about potential violations that required immediate investigation. I knew it was Karen, but knowing and proving are two different things. She was smart enough to use different phone numbers and vary her complaint styles. One report expressed concern about unusual odors that might indicate improper food storage. Another worried about excessive noise levels from my generator. A third suggested that my wastewater disposal might be contaminating nearby storm drains. All of the complaints were completely false, but they were detailed and specific enough to trigger mandatory investigations. Someone had done their research on exactly which phrases would prompt immediate regulatory response. After 3 weeks of constant harassment, I decided to try the direct approach. I walked up to Karen's house, a perfectly manicured colonial with a lawn that looked like it belonged on a golf course. The doorbell played the first few notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Karen answered wearing a pink sweater set and pearls at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. "Who wears pearls to stay home?" "Oh," she said, her smile flickering briefly. "It's you." "Mrs. Mitchell, I think we got off on the wrong foot. I'd like to discuss how we can coexist peacefully. My business provides a service that many residents enjoy, and I've always operated within all applicable laws and regulations." "Mr. Torres," she said, using my last name for the first time, "I've done considerable research into your situation. Did you know that mobile food vendors are classified as transient commercial operators under Municipal Code Section 12-4-7? That classification requires special permits for operation within residential proximity zones." She'd clearly memorized this speech, and she'd looked up my full name. "Interesting. I have all the required permits," I replied calmly. "The city planning office confirmed my compliance just last month." "Yes, but did you know that transient commercial operators can be reclassified as public nuisances if they generate more than 3 formal complaints within a 60-day period? I've been keeping very detailed records of every issue your presence has created." Karen produced a thick binder from behind the door. It was tabbed, color-coded, and looked like something a lawyer would submit to court. Photos, timestamps, incident reports, copies of all the regulatory complaints, and what appeared to be a petition signed by dozens of residents. 37 formal complaints, she continued, flipping through pages with practiced efficiency. Noise violations, traffic obstruction, waste disposal concerns, and aesthetic degradation of neighborhood property values. That's more than enough to trigger a public nuisance hearing. I stared at the binder. Even if half the complaints were fabricated, which they probably were, she'd built an impressive case. This wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was strategic warfare conducted by someone who understood exactly how bureaucratic systems worked. "What do you want?" I asked. Karen's smile returned to full wattage. "I want you to find somewhere else to conduct your little taco business. Somewhere that doesn't impact our peaceful residential community. I'm sure you understand that property values in Willowbrook Estates are quite substantial, and we simply cannot allow commercial activities to diminish our investment. And if I don't, then I'll proceed with the public nuisance hearing. I've already consulted with our HOA attorney, and he's quite confident about our chances. Mobile food vendors rarely win these cases, especially when the complaints are as well documented as mine." I looked at Karen's perfectly organized binder, her professionally planned legal strategy, and her absolutely genuine belief that she was completely in the right. She actually thinks she's protecting the neighborhood from me. That's what makes this dangerous. "I'll consider your proposal," I said finally. "Wonderful. I'm sure you'll make the right decision. You seem like a reasonable person." As I walked back to my truck, I thought about Karen's research into my background. She knew my full name, which meant she'd probably looked up my business license. If she'd dug deeper, she might have found out about Torres Consulting, the firm I'd sold for $8.7 million 3 years earlier. She might have discovered my ongoing contracts with 2 city council members and my friendship with the mayor's chief of staff. She might have learned about my law degree, even though I'd never practiced, or my master's in urban planning. But probably not. Karen struck me as the type who saw what she expected to see. A small business owner she could bully into submission with regulatory harassment and legal threats. Time to educate her about the dangers of incomplete research. The next morning, instead of moving my truck, I parked in the exact same spot on Pine Avenue and started making phone calls. My first call was to my real estate agent, Janet Morrison, who'd helped me buy my current house and had become a good friend. Janet, I need you to find me a very specific property. It needs to be in Willowbrook Estates, preferably with a large yard, and it needs to be available for immediate purchase. Budget is not a concern. Janet laughed. Did you win the lottery? Or are you planning another business venture? Let's call it a strategic investment in community relations. The second call was to Tom Bradley, my former business partner who now ran the city's largest commercial real estate development firm. Tom, I need a favor. Can you walk me through the zoning requirements for residential areas that border commercial properties? Sure, but that's oddly specific. Are you thinking about getting back into development? Something like that. I'm particularly interested in what happens when residential properties are converted to mixed-use or commercial zoning. The third call was to Linda Chong, the city attorney who'd handled the sale of my consulting firm. Linda, hypothetically speaking, what would it take to get a small section of residential property rezoned for commercial use? Assuming all the neighbors were properly notified and given the opportunity to object. Hypothetically, you'd need to demonstrate that the rezoning serves a legitimate public interest, follow all the notification requirements, and survive any appeals process. It's not impossible, but it requires patience and expertise. Why the sudden interest in zoning law? Just exploring some options. By the end of the week, Janet had found exactly what I was looking for, 1527 Elm Street, directly across from Karen's house. The owners were an elderly couple who'd moved to Florida and were motivated to sell quickly. The house was a modest ranch with a huge corner lot, and the asking price was $450,000. I offered $500,000 cash with a 10-day closing. While the purchase was processing, I started phase 2 of my research. Karen had made the mistake of putting her full name and HOA president title on all those regulatory complaints. That gave me everything I needed to pull public records about her background, her property, and her previous addresses. Turns out Karen Mitchell had a pattern. She'd been HOA president in 3 different neighborhoods over the past 12 years. In each case, she'd started campaigns to remove or restrict local businesses that she considered incompatible with residential standards. A coffee cart in Denver, a dog grooming service in Phoenix, a farmer's market in Portland. She'd also filed personal lawsuits against neighbors in each location. Noise complaints, property line disputes, and harassment allegations. Most were settled out of court, but the pattern was clear. Karen used legal pressure to get her way, and she moved on once she'd established complete control or burned too many bridges. She's done this before. She's good at it. But she's never done it to someone with my resources. The closing on 1527 Elm Street went smoothly. I paid cash, waived inspections, and took possession on a Thursday morning. Karen's house was directly across the street, maybe 60 feet from my new front door. Perfect. That afternoon, I applied for a zoning variance to operate a limited commercial food service facility on my new property. The application was thorough, professionally prepared, and included supporting documentation from 3 different urban planning consultants I'd hired. The proposed operation would serve food from a fixed location for a maximum of 16 hours per day, with appropriate parking, waste management, and noise mitigation measures. City zoning law required notification of all property owners within 300 feet of any variance request. Karen's house was definitely within that radius. The notification letter arrived at Karen's mailbox on Saturday morning. By Saturday afternoon, she was pounding on my front door. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded when I answered. She was still wearing pearls, but her sweater set had been replaced by a Georgetown Law sweatshirt. Interesting wardrobe choice for intimidation purposes. "I'm exploring my property rights as a homeowner in this lovely neighborhood," I replied pleasantly. "Would you like to come in for coffee? You cannot open a restaurant in a residential area. It's against zoning laws, HOA bylaws, and common sense. Actually, the zoning variance process exists specifically to address situations where property owners want to use their land in ways that might technically fall outside standard residential classifications. It's a perfectly legal procedure, assuming all the requirements are met." Karen clutched the notification letter like it had personally insulted her. "I'll fight this. The HOA will never approve it. The neighbors will revolt. You'll spend years in hearings and appeals, and you'll lose anyway. Maybe, I agreed. But here's the thing, Karen. I bought this house specifically to apply for this variance. I have the time, money, and expertise to navigate every step of the process. And even if I ultimately lose, the application alone will take at least 6 months to resolve. During that time, I can continue operating my food truck from the public street, just like I always have. I watched Karen's face as she processed the implications. She'd won a tactical victory by making my original location difficult to use, but I'd responded by escalating to a strategic level she hadn't anticipated. "You're doing this to spite me," she said. "I'm doing this because you made it clear that you won't tolerate my business anywhere in your vicinity. So I decided to bring it as close as possible while remaining completely within the law." Karen's perfectly composed mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something that might have been panic. She's starting to realize she's not dealing with her usual opponent. "We'll see about that," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. The zoning hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, I kept operating my food truck from Pine Avenue while making preparations for the next phase of my plan. Karen spent those 3 weeks marshaling opposition to my variance request. She organized a petition drive, scheduled neighborhood meetings, and even hired her own urban planning consultant to argue against the proposal. Her HOA attorney filed formal objections citing traffic concerns, noise issues, and incompatibility with residential character. She was thorough, organized, and completely outmatched. The night before the zoning hearing, I had dinner with Mayor Patricia Rodriguez, whom I'd known since her city council days. She'd been one of my first clients when I started Torres Consulting, and we'd remained friends even after I sold the firm. "Mike, I have to ask, why are you really doing this? A zoning variance for a single food truck seems like overkill, even for you. Sometimes you have to send a message, Patricia." Karen Mitchell has been harassing small business owners for years. She uses regulatory complaints and legal threats to bully people into submission. I have the resources to show her what happens when she picks on someone who can fight back. And if the variance gets approved, then I'll have the legal right to operate a food service business from my residential property. It'll be completely legitimate, properly regulated, and absolutely infuriating to someone who thinks she can control what happens in her neighborhood through intimidation. Patricia smiled. "You know the hearing's just a formality, right? Tom Bradley already told me your application is bulletproof from a legal standpoint. The Planning Commission won't have grounds to deny it." The hearing went exactly as expected. Karen's attorney presented well-organized objections that were technically sound, but ultimately irrelevant. My urban planning consultants demonstrated that the proposed food service facility met all applicable safety, traffic, and environmental requirements. The Planning Commission voted 4-1 to approve the variance, with conditions that I'd already accounted for in my application. Karen sat in the front row throughout the entire proceeding, taking detailed notes and whispering urgently to her attorney. When the final vote was announced, she looked like someone had just told her the sun was planning to rise in the west. Phase 1 complete. Now for the fun part. I spent the next 2 weeks converting my front yard into a food service operation that was technically compliant with every regulation while being maximally annoying to Karen. The permit allowed for limited commercial food service, which I interpreted as broadly as possible. Instead of just parking my food truck, I installed a permanent pavilion with picnic tables, string lights, and a sound system for ambient music. I brought in a second truck to expand the menu options. I added outdoor seating for 40 people and applied for a beer and wine license. Everything was legal, properly permitted, and completely within the scope of my variance approval. It was also directly across the street from Karen's living room window. The grand opening was on a Friday evening. I'd invited everyone from my customer mailing list, plus about half the city's food bloggers. Local news showed up because "Man opens restaurant in front yard despite HOA president" was exactly the kind of story that played well on social media. By 7 p.m., there were over 100 people in my front yard, enjoying gourmet tacos and craft beer while a mariachi band provided entertainment. The party was visible from Karen's house, audible from 3 blocks away, and absolutely, completely legal under the terms of my zoning variance. Karen appeared on her front porch around 8:30, wearing a bathrobe and clutching her phone. She stood there for 10 minutes, watching the celebration in my yard, before disappearing back inside. 20 minutes later, 3 police cars arrived in response to noise complaints. Officer Martinez, whom I recognized from my previous encounter with Karen's regulatory harassment, approached with a resigned expression. "Mr. Torres, we got reports of excessive noise and possible permit violations. You mind if we take a look?" "Of course, officer. Here's my zoning variance, my food service permit, my beer and wine license, and my temporary entertainment permit for the mariachi band. Everything expires at 10 p.m., exactly as specified." Officer Martinez reviewed the paperwork, checked the noise levels with his decibel meter, and confirmed that we were within all applicable limits. "Looks like everything's in order," he said. "Enjoy your party." As the police cars drove away, I saw Karen watching from behind her curtains. Now she knows how it feels to call in complaints that go nowhere. The restaurant, which I named Karma's Kitchen, operated exactly as permitted, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. I hired additional staff to handle the increased volume and expanded the menu to include breakfast burritos, lunch specials, and dinner entrees. Business was fantastic, partly because the food was genuinely excellent and partly because customers loved the story behind it. Karen tried everything she could think of to shut me down. She filed complaints with every regulatory agency, hired attorneys to challenge my permits, and even organized protests on the public sidewalk in front of my house. Nothing worked because everything I was doing was completely legal. After 6 weeks of this, Karen appeared at my front gate on a Tuesday morning. She looked exhausted, defeated, and desperate. Her perfect hair was slightly mussed, and she wasn't wearing pearls. "Please," she said, "what do you want? Money? I'll pay you to relocate. Just name your price." I turned off the grill and walked over to the gate. "Karen, I tried to have a reasonable conversation with you months ago. You chose to escalate to regulatory harassment and legal threats. Now we're playing by your rules, but I'm better at this game than you are. This is insane. You bought a house just to annoy me. I bought a house to demonstrate that actions have consequences. You spent years bullying small business owners with complaints and lawsuits. Now you get to experience what it's like when someone uses the system against you." Karen's composure finally cracked completely. "I can't sleep. Do you have any idea what it's like having a restaurant in your front yard? The noise, the smells, the constant stream of people? My property value has probably dropped by $100,000. And there it is. The moment she finally understands. "Now you know how it feels," I said quietly. "But here's the difference between us, Karen. When you harassed other business owners, you were trying to destroy their livelihoods out of spite and control. I'm operating a legitimate business that serves the community and follows every applicable law. Your only complaint is that my success is inconvenient for you." Karen stared at me with growing horror as the full scope of her situation became clear. I own the house across from hers. My zoning variance was permanent. My permits were all current and valid. I had the resources to operate Karma's Kitchen indefinitely, and every attempt she'd made to shut me down had only attracted more customers and media attention. She'd declared war on someone she thought was powerless, and discovered too late that she'd chosen the wrong opponent entirely.